The floor came up fast. 1 second Ameera was standing in a room full of silk gowns and champagne flutes. The next, her palms were skidding across cold marble and every conversation in the ballroom had stopped. Not because anyone was going to help her. Because watching someone fall, it turned out, was the most interesting thing that had happened all evening. Ryan stood over her, his chest heaving, his jaw tight. The same jaw she'd memorized every angle of during 2 years she was still trying to forget. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't drunk. He was deliberate, which was somehow so much worse than either of those things would have been. No one moved. 58 guests in formal wear found somewhere else to look. A woman in a silver gown glanced over, registered what she was seeing, and returned to her champagne without a word. A man in a charcoal suit checked his watch. The music kept playing from somewhere above them, soft and ambient and completely indifferent to what was happening on the ballroom floor. Except one man. He was at the far wall, leaning against the bar with a glass of scotch between his fingers that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Korean, late 20s, dressed in a navy suit that cost more than most people's rent. He wasn't filming. He wasn't whispering to anyone beside him. He was simply, completely, dangerously still, the way a predator goes quiet the moment it decides to move. Then he set his glass down. Then he rolled up his sleeves. And every person in that room who recognized who he was took one quiet, involuntary step backward. That moment wasn't the beginning. It was the consequence. And this is how it all started. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in a cream envelope with no return address. Ameera had stood at her kitchen counter holding it for 3 full minutes before she opened it, a hesitation that had become second nature since she left Ryan. You learn to pause before you open things. You learn to check the exit of a room before you settled into it. You learned that the body carries information the mind is still working to catch up to, and that the discomfort in your chest when something feels slightly off is not anxiety. It is intelligence. The envelope wasn't from Ryan. It was from Kezia Abera, her oldest friend from the Chelsea Gallery where they'd both worked for 2 years. Kezia, who had perfect instincts about art and terrible instincts about men, who somehow always got invited to the most inexplicable things, who had written in the margin of the card in her looping cursive, Ameera. You need this. You need to remember what it feels like to exist in a room without flinching. Come. Where something read. Ameera had stared at that last line for a long time. She went because Kezia was right in the way that only people who love you enough to say the uncomfortable thing are ever right. She had been hiding. Not consciously. She had a job. She had friends she saw regularly. She had an apartment with plants that were thriving and a morning routine she was genuinely proud of. But hiding is not always a physical act. Sometimes it looks like a woman who wears gray in a season where she used to wear color, who sits facing the door in restaurants, who has declined 4 social invitations in the past month because the prospect of being in a large room with strangers felt like too much to manage. The venue was a converted private club in Midtown that didn't appear on any accessible map or public listing. You were given the address by encrypted text 2 hours before the event and told to arrive alone or in pairs. The building had no brass nameplate, no visible signage, and no doorman who looked like a doorman, only a man in a dark suit by an unmarked door who checked your name against a list on a device she couldn't see the screen of, then stepped aside without a word. Inside, the space was extraordinary. The original architecture had been kept, carved ceiling moldings, enormous chandeliers dropping glittering geometry across the marble floors, floor-length velvet curtains over the tall windows, but filled with the kind of people who treated extraordinary settings as perfectly ordinary. The guests were finance, tech, old money, newer money that had learned to dress like old money, art collectors, 3 people Ameera recognized from publications she read, and a general atmosphere of the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because the room already knows. She had worn the red dress. The red satin one she'd bought 2 weeks after she left Ryan, the night she walked past a boutique window and stopped because something in the window stopped her, not the dress exactly, but the version of herself she imagined in it. The woman she used to be before 2 years of careful, incremental diminishment. She'd carried it home and hung it in her new closet like a flag planted in newly claimed territory, and for 4 months she'd looked at it every morning and told herself, not yet. Tonight, for the first time, she had taken it off the hanger. That was not her mistake. She would spend a long time afterward cataloging her mistakes, and wearing the dress was not one of them. Her mistake, if she was being precise about it, was the particular quality of relief she had allowed herself to feel when she walked into that ballroom, and nothing bad happened in the first 20 minutes. The specific loosening of the vigilance she had maintained for 4 months, the small, quiet interior voice that said, maybe you've outrun it. Maybe you've put enough distance between yourself and Ryan Evan that the threat is theoretical now. Maybe tonight you can just be a woman at a party in a red dress, and that's all. She had been standing near the far end of the bar, holding a glass of sparkling water she'd been pretending to sip for 40 minutes, engaged in a conversation about a Brazilian photographer whose work she genuinely loved, when she felt it. Not heard it. Not saw it. Felt it, the particular shift in atmospheric pressure that happened specifically and only when Ryan Evan entered a room she was in. She had never been able to give it a name that didn't sound like something a therapist would want to unpack. A drop in temperature. A ripple in whatever safety she'd been standing inside. A sensation in her sternum that the body gives when it recognizes a specific threat before the conscious mind has processed the visual input. She turned. He was already looking at her. He was wearing a white dress shirt, no tie, collar open at 2 buttons. The jacket he'd paired it with clearly expensive and clearly chosen with care. He looked like a man who had come to this party with a specific intention and was pleased to find everything going according to plan. He was smiling the wide, slow smile she had once believed was exclusively for her, the smile she had once described to her sister as like being chosen. She understood now that the smile was a performance, that it had always been a performance. But understanding that in her mind did not stop her body from responding to it with the particular fear that is specific to things you have learned to be afraid of at a cellular level. She turned away. She set her glass down, said something to the photographer about getting a drink, and began walking calmly. She instructed herself, stay calm, don't make it visible, toward the far side of the room where she'd last seen Kezia. She counted 4 steps. She was planning the next 4 when his hand closed around her arm from behind. Ameera. His voice was warm, social, calibrated exactly for the room. Anyone listening would have heard a man greeting a woman he knew warmly. Nothing in his tone would have alarmed them. Where are you going? I haven't seen you in months. Let go of me. She kept her own voice equally calibrated. Equally useless as a signal to the surrounding room. I just want to talk. The grip tightened slightly, pleasantly, the way you'd hold someone's arm to guide them. 2 minutes. Then you can go wherever you want. Ryan. She looked at his hand on her arm. I said let go. His fingers tightened. She had prepared for this moment in at least 40 variations over 4 months. In her therapist's office, in journal entries at 2 in the morning, in the specific rehearsals she ran through while washing dishes because it gave her hands something to do. In some versions she was surgically calm. In others she screamed. In 2 very late-night versions she had used the self-defense technique she'd spent $60 learning in a Saturday workshop, and it had worked with a satisfying completeness. In the real version, her voice left her body the moment his hand closed around her arm. In the real version, her knees became liquid and her hands became cold, and 4 months of careful preparation folded under the specific, irreducible weight of him being physically present and unafraid. You embarrass me, he said, still pleasantly. When you left like that? I think we need to clear some things up. There's nothing to clear up. He moved so fast the room didn't track it. His hand left her arm and went to her shoulder, not gripping this time, but shoving, one sharp, deliberate movement. And the world tilted sideways with the speed of it, and then she was falling, and then the marble floor rose up and caught her with a sound she would replay for days afterward. The flat, unmistakable impact of a body losing its balance in a formal room where nothing is supposed to sound like that. The conversation stopped. Ameera was on her hands and knees on the ballroom floor, the red dress splayed around her, her left palm stinging from the impact, her right knee bent at an angle that would leave a bruise. The room had gone quiet in the specific way that a crowd goes quiet when something has happened that everyone has seen and everyone has agreed, in the same instant, not to acknowledge. She looked up. 58 people in silk and tailoring looked somewhere else. The woman in the silver gown who had been 3 feet away turned back to her conversation with a smoothness that was almost impressive in its commitment. The man in the charcoal tuxedo raised his phone, held it briefly, then lowered it without taking a photograph. 2 people near the windows became very interested in the view. The music kept playing, ambient, string-adjacent, designed for exactly this kind of room, and the room let it fill the space where intervention might have been. Ryan crouched down beside her. He put one knee on the floor, like a man checking on someone who'd tripped. He was still wearing the smile that worked in closed rooms. "Get up," he said quietly. "You're making a scene." "You pushed me," she said. Her voice, she was surprised to find, was steady. "You stumbled. Everyone can see you stumbled." He reached for her elbow. "We're going to finish this conversation somewhere private." "We are not going anywhere." She pulled her arm back. "Don't touch me." He reached again. He didn't reach her. She heard the footsteps a half-second before she registered them as significant, measured, unhurried, moving through the crowd in the way that crowds part for certainty rather than size. She looked up expecting security and instead saw a man she had noticed once before tonight, Korean, late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a deep navy suit that had never seen a department store rack, who had been standing at the bar 30 minutes ago with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. She had noticed him the way she automatically noticed all composed, still people in enclosed spaces as potential information, then moved on. He was not moving on now. He walked toward them with the unhurried, absolute certainty of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply walking toward it. He stopped 3 feet away from Ryan. He did not look at Ameera immediately, not because she didn't matter, she would understand this much later, but because he was communicating directly and exclusively with the problem, and the problem was Ryan. Then he did something that appeared, on its surface, to be nothing at all. He reached for the cuff of his jacket sleeve. He folded it back to his forearm slowly, with total deliberateness, 2 neat folds. Then he did the same on the right side. His eyes did not leave Ryan's face for the duration of this action. His expression did not change. The room went quiet in a completely different register. The first quiet had been the quiet of willful, collective ignorance. This quiet was something else, older, more animal. It was the quiet of a room full of people who had just recognized, at a level below language, that something was in the room with them that they did not want to be adjacent to. Guests took small, unconscious steps backward. Conversations did not resume. Someone's glass clinked against another glass and then went still. Ryan stood up. He tried to find his composure and almost recovered it. "Mind your business," he said. "This is private." The man said nothing. He waited with the patience of someone for whom patience was not a virtue but a tactic. "I don't know who you are," Ryan said, louder now, which was a mistake because louder meant he'd lost the room and was trying to reclaim it with volume, "but you need to walk away from this right now." The man looked at him for a moment that stretched past comfortable. Then, "Let her up." Not a question. Not a negotiation. 2 words, said at a volume that required the room to be quiet to hear them, which the room was. Ryan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Ameera, then back at the man. Something had shifted in his face, not fear yet, but the precursor to fear, the moment where a man realizes the room has changed and he hasn't caught up to it yet. "Last time I'll say it," Ryan said. The man's gaze dropped briefly to Ameera. Not pitying. Not dramatic. Simply certain, in the way of someone issuing a direction to a person they already trust to follow it. "Get up," he said. She got up. Her palms still stung. Her knee ached. The room watched her stand, and she let it because she was not going to stay on that floor 1 second longer than she already had. Ryan opened his mouth. The man turned the full weight of his attention back to him, and Ryan closed it. "Who are you?" Ryan's voice came out smaller than he intended. The man held the silence for exactly as long as he chose to before he answered. "Park Tae-Hyun." 2 words. Quietly spoken. No performance in them at all. And Ameera watched Ryan Evan, a man she had never once in 2 years seen look afraid of anything, go the color of a candle that has just been blown out. You're going to want to see what happens next. Drop your location and the time you're watching. This is just beginning. He didn't take her home. He sent her home, which was different. Ameera would come to understand over the following days, in the way that almost everything about Park Tae-Hyun turned out to be different from what she initially understood. Sending someone somewhere implied a direction given and honored, not accompanied. It implied a specific kind of trust in the other person's capacity to follow through. Or possibly it implied he had other things to handle in that ballroom after she left, and she chose not to think too carefully about what those things might look like. There was a car waiting outside the venue that she hadn't called, a sleek black sedan with a driver who emerged to open the door before she'd reached the curb, who handed her a small card through the window after she'd settled in. The card was cream-colored, the same weight stock as a personal correspondence card. On it was written an address in clean, deliberate script. Below the address, a time, 10 a.m. And below that, in the same handwriting, "This is voluntary. You are not obligated to come." She stared at the card for the entire 40-minute drive back to her apartment. She turned it over twice looking for a name. She found none. Her apartment was the kind of space that told the story of a life built from intentional scratch, second-hand furniture she'd assembled with the specific care of someone who needed every object around her to be chosen by her. Art on the walls from the gallery where she worked, plants in the windows she checked on with the attentiveness of someone who had learned that small acts of maintenance were actually acts of faith. She sat at her kitchen table with the card between her fingers and a cup of chamomile she'd made out of habit and didn't drink, and she thought about the look on Ryan's face when Tae-Hyun said his name. That draining pallor. That involuntary, total recognition. She had lived alongside Ryan Evan for 2 years. She had watched him manage board members, intimidate subordinates, charm investors, and dismiss critics without breaking a sweat. She had never, in all of that time and proximity, seen him become afraid of another person. She had not believed, until last night, that he was capable of it. She went to the address. The building was in a part of the city that didn't announce itself, no public-facing lobby art, no brass nameplates, no signage of any kind that indicated what the building contained or who it contained them for. The security was the kind that had learned to look like architecture. 2 men near the entrance who appeared to be simply standing, a woman at an interior desk who appeared to be simply working, an elevator that required a code that the woman provided without being asked in a way that communicated she had been expecting Ameera specifically. The floor she was brought to was empty of visible staff. The space she walked into was the kind of expensive that had moved entirely past demonstration and into pure function, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a gray river shining in the late morning light, low furniture in charcoal and cream, a single ceramic vase of white flowers on a table near the far window that seemed to be the room's only concession to decoration. The air was cool and very still. Park Tae-Hyun was standing when she entered. He was dressed differently from the night before, gray dress shirt, no jacket, the same forearms that had appeared in the ballroom in their rolled sleeves now visible below pushed-up cuffs, resting at his sides. He looked, in daylight, like a man who had slept normally and was unbothered by this, which she found simultaneously comforting and faintly suspicious. "You came," he said. "You helped me." She stopped just inside the door. "I wanted to understand why." He studied her for a moment, not intrusively, but with the quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he processed things. Then he gestured toward the seating area. She chose a chair. He didn't sit. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want to ask you to stay in your seat when I do. I'm not saying this to manage you. I'm saying it because the information is significant and people sometimes need a moment to hold it before they respond, and I'd rather you have that moment." She didn't like the architecture of that sentence. "What?" He moved to the window. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the river with the expression of a man composing words with the kind of care that comes from knowing wrong words have real costs. Ryan Evan has been carrying significant debt for approximately 18 months. Not financial debt, or not only that, the kind of debt that accumulates when you borrow from organizations that don't operate through conventional channels. They don't charge interest. They charge collateral. They charge access. They charge whatever they decide they are owed, and the accounting is entirely at their discretion. Ameera waited. The river outside the window was very gray and very still. 3 months ago, approximately the time you left him, Ryan could not meet the payment schedule he'd committed to. The people he owed made it clear that failure had a consequence. Ryan offered them something he claimed he still had a claim to. The room was very quiet. He offered you, Tae-Hyun said, as collateral against the debt. The sentence landed in the center of the room the way heavy objects land when dropped from height, with a sound and a weight that continues after the impact. Ameera heard it and her body moved through a sequence she recognized from the worst moments of the past 2 years, cold spreading from the center outward, then a wave of heat behind it. Then the particular nausea she associated with the moments in her relationship with Ryan where she had been forced to understand, again, that he had never once seen her as a person. He used me as collateral, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Yes, I left him. She was aware her hands had tightened on the arms of the chair. I changed my number. I moved. I was gone. He didn't have any. He acted as though he did. Tae-Hyun's voice was flat and factual. Not cold, there was a distinction, but without softening, because softening would have been its own kind of condescension. The organization he owed accepted the arrangement. They have been watching you for the entire 3 months since you left. The dark sedan you noticed outside your building twice last month. The man who stood outside the coffee shop you pass on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That was surveillance, Ameera. Not coincidence. Not your anxiety. She had told herself it was her anxiety. She had sat in her therapist's office and worked carefully on not letting her fear of Ryan distort her perception of neutral events. She had practiced, with some success, the skill of not seeing threats in ordinary things. She hadn't been distorting anything. Why are you telling me this? She asked. The question came out steadier than she expected. Tae-Hyun moved away from the window. He came to stand closer to the sitting area, not close enough to crowd her space, near enough to be present rather than performatively distant. Because 4 days ago, he said, I bought your contract. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the previous ones. I'm sorry. The debt Ryan owed. I settled it in full with the primary creditor. The terms Ryan had attached to the settlement, including the collateral clause that named you, I paid out and formally voided. There is no contract. There is no arrangement. There is no claim on you in any ledger held by anyone connected to that debt. He met her eyes with the directness she was coming to understand was simply how he communicated. You are free of it. You were free of it 4 days ago, before last night. I was going to tell you differently than this. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Ameera had spent 4 months reclaiming her life with the meticulous, deliberate effort of someone rebuilding something from its foundation up. She had fought for her own name, her own space, her own mornings, her own choices item by item, day by day, with a care that sometimes exhausted her but that she understood was necessary. She had done this alone, and she had been proud of doing it alone, and now she was sitting in the penthouse of a stranger who was telling her that while she had been rebuilding, someone else had been buying. The fury came first. It always came first. You bought me, she said. I bought a document that had no legal or moral validity. He didn't flinch. A contract that was created without your knowledge or consent by a person who had no right to name you in it. There is a meaningful difference between acquiring a fraudulent claim and acquiring a person. Is there? She didn't say it aggressively. She said it because she genuinely wanted to know where he stood in his own thinking on this. Yes. He sat down then, across from her, with deliberate physical consideration of the space between them. I hold the document. I don't hold you. What I did last night at the party, and what I'm telling you now, is separate from anything Ryan arranged. He created a situation in which people with real capacity for harm believed they had a claim on your life. I removed that claim. What you do from this point forward, where you go, who you trust, how you live, is entirely yours. She looked at him for a long time. He let her. Why? She said finally. Not the transactional why, not what do you get from this, though that question was forming, but the more fundamental one. Why you? Why did you know about this? Why were you at that party? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet, the kind that precedes an honest answer. Because I know what Ryan Evan is, he said. And I know that the organization he borrowed from is not the kind that makes threats it fails to carry out. And I know, he paused, slightly, the only break in his composure she had yet witnessed, that the people he owed were significantly more dangerous than he understood when he made that arrangement. He thought he was buying time. He was accelerating a timeline he didn't have the information to comprehend. That still doesn't tell me why me specifically. Why you bought it. Why you were watching. He looked at her steadily. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He didn't offer more. And she found, to her own complicated surprise, that the honesty of the non-answer told her more than a constructed explanation would have. She left 40 minutes later carrying 3 things: the card with his personal number, the information that her 3 months of safety had been a carefully managed illusion, and a question she was not yet ready to ask directly. He had paid Ryan's debt. He had cleared her from a ledger she hadn't known she was in. And she still didn't know what he intended to put in the space where that arrangement had been. She stood on the sidewalk outside his building in the cold morning air, and she thought, he knew before I did. He knew, and he moved, and now I'm standing here trying to figure out what I owe to a man who told me specifically that I don't owe him anything. The city moved around her in its indifferent way. She put her hands in her pockets and started walking, and she thought about what it meant to be freed from a cage you'd been living in without knowing the bars were there. What would you do if your freedom was bought without your consent? Drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. This conversation needs to happen. She called him 5 days after their meeting. Not because she'd been thinking about him, or not only because of that. She called because she came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find her apartment door unlocked. Not broken. Not forced. Unlocked, in the specific way of a lock opened by the correct key and then simply not secured again, a message in the medium of access itself. Her key turned without resistance and the door swung inward, and she stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds before she went inside, running through everything she remembered about leaving that morning: the click of the bolt, the test of the handle. The habit she'd built so carefully over 4 months of checking and rechecking. She had locked it. She was certain. She went in because going back was not an option she was willing to choose. She'd spent 4 months refusing to let fear make her spatial decisions, and she moved through the apartment with her phone already open to the emergency dial screen, checking each room with a slowness that felt like courage and probably was. Nothing was missing. Nothing was visibly moved. The plants were in their windows. Her laptop was on her desk. Her jewelry was in its tray. On her kitchen table, which she had left clear that morning, there was an envelope. Cream-colored. Her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, printed cleanly on high-quality paper. The photograph showed Ameera from behind, on the sidewalk outside Tae-Hyun's building, on the morning she had gone to meet him. She was captured mid-stride, coat collar up against the cold, looking ahead. Whoever took the photograph had been close enough to make out the earrings she'd been wearing. She called Tae-Hyun. He answered on the second ring, and she told him. She did not perform calm for him. She was shaking slightly, and she let the slight shake be in her voice because she was done performing calm for the benefit of people who were trying to frighten her. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her 2 specific, practical questions about the photograph and then said, "Stay inside. I'm sending someone." She was going to say she didn't need someone sent, that she was a competent adult who had managed 4 months of threat alone and who did not require dispatching. Then she looked at the photograph again, at the specific quality of closeness in it, and said, "Okay." The person he sent was a woman named Min, who arrived 40 minutes later wearing a dark coat and carrying a bag that Ameera suspected did not contain the things a casual visitor's bag would contain. Min was in her mid-30s, shorter than Ameera, with the kind of face that registered as entirely unremarkable until you watched her move through a space, at which point something in her carriage communicated, without any aggression, without any display. that she was the most capable person in any room she entered. Min moved through Ameera's apartment the way she seemed to move through everything, efficiently, without commentary, with a specificity of attention to certain details, the scratch marks on the door lock, the angle of the kitchen window, the sightlines from the hallway to the main living space, that told Ameera something significant about what Min's days normally looked like. "Your lock was picked," Min said, closing her bag. "Professionally. Someone who knew what they were doing and didn't want you to know it happened." "Who?" "I'll know more by morning." Min looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to be useful rather than reassuring. "Tonight, I'd like you to come with me." The apartment Min took her to was a 15-minute drive across the city, clean, quiet, entirely impersonal in the way of a space prepared rather than lived in, with a courtyard view instead of a street view, which Ameera immediately understood was tactical. You couldn't see who was watching from a courtyard the way you could from a street. Min checked the windows before she left. She gave Ameera a number to call if anything, and she meant anything. She said it twice, felt wrong, and she left. Ameera sat in the clean, prepared space and thought about the photograph. About whoever had stood close enough behind her to capture the detail of her earrings. About the fact that she had checked over her shoulder 3 times on the way to Tae-Hyun's building that morning and seen nothing, and about what it meant that nothing was apparently not accurate. Tae-Hyun came to see her the following evening. He called 10 minutes ahead, or rather Min told her 10 minutes ahead, which Ameera suspected was his version of calling ahead. And he arrived carrying food from a Korean restaurant whose name she immediately forgot because it was entirely in Korean and because the food, when she opened the containers, was extraordinary in a way that made the name irrelevant. They sat at the table in the prepared apartment and ate together, and he asked her about the gallery. She told him about the current show, a photographer from Lagos whose work used architecture to talk about interiority, about the way the buildings people construct around themselves reflect what they're protecting, and she watched him listen. He listened the way he did everything, without performance, with a completeness that made her feel, rather than merely believe, that she was being heard. She asked him about Korea. He told her about his grandmother's apartment in a part of Seoul that had been almost entirely demolished and rebuilt in the decade since he'd left, the specific grief of returning to a place and finding only the shape of it remaining. The street layout preserved while everything that had made the street itself was gone. He mentioned a younger sister briefly. He didn't elaborate and she didn't press. She didn't ask about the business. He didn't offer it. This felt, she was surprised to find, less like avoidance and more like a mutual, unspoken agreement that some things arrived in their own time and rushing them didn't help. Later, over the end of the meal, he set his chopsticks down with the particular deliberateness that she had already learned to read as a signal. The photograph was from a man named Choi, he said. He wasn't part of the original arrangement between Ryan and the primary creditor. He had a secondary stake, the kind of peripheral financial interest that exists in these structures without being formally documented, and when I settled the primary debt and voided the contract, he was not satisfied with the outcome. What does he want? To demonstrate that he has access to you. To communicate to me that my clearing of Ryan's debt from the primary ledger doesn't resolve what he considers his portion of the account. Tae-Hyun was entirely even-toned about this in a way that might have been frightening if she hadn't, by this point, come to understand that the even tone was not indifference. It was precision. He's posturing. He wants to see what my response is before he decides what his next move will be. Is posturing better or worse than the alternative? Better. It means he's uncertain. Men who are certain don't posture, they act. Choi is waiting to calibrate. And what does your response look like? He looked at her across the table. The evening light came through the courtyard window at an angle that caught the side of his face, and she thought about the man at the bar with the glass he hadn't touched, and about what it was like to be the thing that man's stillness had been aimed at. I'm going to meet with him, he said. When? Tomorrow. And then he'll understand that this situation is resolved. That there is no version of this where his secondary stake translates into any claim on you or any leverage over me. He held her gaze steadily. He'll understand it clearly enough that it won't require revisiting. You say that like it's simple. It is simple. It's not easy. There's a difference. She thought about that. Why does it matter to you that he understands it? Why not just, she paused, because she was not sure how to finish the sentence without stepping into territory she didn't have the full map of. Because clarity is cleaner than escalation, he said, finishing the thought she hadn't finished. And because what I want is for this to be over for you, not for it to become something larger. She looked at him. For me, she said. Yes. That's the second time you've framed it that way. He held her gaze and didn't answer, and she decided this was another one of those non-answers that told her more than a constructed response would. The meeting with Choi happened the next afternoon. Ameera wasn't there. She knew about it afterward, piece by piece, through Min, who spoke with the measured economy of someone trained to share only what had been cleared for sharing, but who had, over 5 days of proximity, apparently decided that Ameera could absorb more than she was being given and adjusted accordingly. Tae-Hyun had gone without visible security. Not without security, Min was careful to distinguish between these two things, but without security that Choi could see, which was itself a specific kind of message. He arrived at a private room above a Korean restaurant in Koreatown at 2 in the afternoon. Choi had brought 2 men. Tae-Hyun had come with only a manila envelope. He didn't say much, Min told her. He sat down. He opened the envelope and put one document on the table: settlement offer, clean terms, fair value for what Choi's secondary stake was actually worth on paper. No room for negotiation because the offer was already fair and Tae-Hyun knew it was fair, and he needed Choi to understand that Tae-Hyun knew. Min paused. Choi's men started getting uncomfortable. Choi looked at the document. He looked at Tae-Hyun. He looked at the document again. Then he signed it, Ameera guessed. Min nodded. He picked up the pen. Ameera sat with that image for a while, a man looking at Park Tae-Hyun's forearms resting on a restaurant table and deciding, without any explicit threat having been made, that signing the document was the correct choice. He does that, she said, not quite to Min, makes a room understand something without saying it. It's more efficient than saying it, Min said, which was the most information Ameera had gotten from her about Tae-Hyun's methods in 5 days, and which she stored carefully. That evening, alone in the prepared apartment with the city lights coming through the courtyard window, Ameera sat cross-legged on the couch and thought about the question she had been circling for a week. She was no longer in anyone's ledger. She was safe, more comprehensively and actually safe than she had been at any point since she'd left Ryan. She was being looked after, protected, she corrected herself, because looked after made it sound pastoral when the reality was considerably more deliberate than that. She picked up her phone. She opened his contact, which she'd saved with only his last name, the way you save a contact when you aren't ready to decide what it means yet. She typed, "Why are you doing all of this?" She looked at the question for a long moment. She sent it. The reply came 4 minutes later, which was long enough to be considered and short enough to be genuine. Because someone should have. She read it 3 times. 5 words. As clean and unembellished as everything else about him. Not heroic. Not romantic. Just correct, in the way of things that are true rather than things that are performed. Because someone should have. Because 60 people in formal wear found somewhere else to look, and because Ryan had been doing this for years to a woman who deserved better, and because the systems that were supposed to protect her had not, and because she read it a 4th time. Because someone should have, and he had decided that someone was him. She didn't write back that night. She put her phone down and looked at the courtyard lights and thought about the specific texture of feeling safe without fully understanding why, which was its own strange and unfamiliar territory. If you think this ends here, stay with me. What Ryan does next will change everything. Don't forget to drop your city in the comments. Ryan made his last move on a Tuesday morning, and it was almost elegant in its stupidity. For 2 weeks after the Choi situation resolved, he had been quiet. Long enough that Ameera had begun to do the thing she always warned herself against doing, letting the absence of threat feel like the end of it. She had started going back to her own apartment, watering her plants with the particular deliberateness of someone reclaiming a routine, sleeping without the bedroom door barricaded for the first time since she'd left him. She had started thinking, carefully and with a lot of internal caveats, about what came next, about the gallery, about a show she wanted to propose for the spring, about a conversation she was not yet ready to have with herself about a man who answered her late-night texts within 4 minutes and never asked for anything back. The knock on her apartment door came at 7 in the morning. It was Min, and Min's face when Ameera opened the door was the face of someone who had bad news packaged in the most controlled way they knew how to package it. Min had been stopping by less frequently now that the choice situation had closed, but Ameera had her number and she had Ameera's, and this was a visit rather than a check-in. Ryan contacted the primary creditor, Min said. She had come inside. She was standing in Ameera's kitchen, which felt simultaneously surreal and entirely natural in the way things that have become your reality feel. The one Tae-Hyun settled with. He reached out directly 2 days ago. Ameera was very still. What did he say? He offered a new arrangement. He claims to have information about Tae-Hyun's operations, specific information, the kind that would be valuable to people who want leverage over Tae-Hyun specifically. He offered to exchange this information in return for having his original debt reinstated. With you as collateral. Again. The silence in the kitchen was complete. Ameera set down the mug she'd been holding. She set it down very carefully, because her hands had gone cold in the specific way they went cold when Ryan even entered her vicinity in any form, physically, by name, by the ripple effect of his decisions landing in her life again. He wants to use me to get to Tae-Hyun, she said. Yes. His logic appears to be that if he can reinstall you as leverage, he can use Tae-Hyun's interest in your safety as a way to neutralize the threat Tae-Hyun represents to him. Min said this with the flat precision of someone reading a damage assessment. He's assuming that Tae-Hyun cares about your well-being enough to be controllable through it. Ameera thought about this for a moment. Does the creditor know that Tae-Hyun already settled the original debt? Yes. So Ryan is trying to do business with someone who has already done business with Tae-Hyun, using the person Tae-Hyun specifically cleared from that arrangement. That's essentially accurate. She stopped. That's almost impressively stupid. It is, Min said, with the faint, controlled quality of someone who agreed, but was not going to editorialize. Tae-Hyun knows. He's been informed. What is he going to do? Min looked at her steadily. I think that's partly what he's waiting to hear from you. She called Tae-Hyun. He answered before the first ring had fully completed. She didn't know what that meant and decided it probably meant several things simultaneously. Min told you, he said. Min told me. She was at her kitchen window, the city outside doing its indifferent morning thing, pigeons on the neighboring roofline unbothered by any of it. I want to ask you something before you tell me what you're planning. Okay. What happens to Ryan, whatever happens, I want it to be my decision too. Not because I need to be involved in the logistics, but because I need it to not be something that happens to me. I need to have made a choice about it. The pause on the other end was brief. What do you want? She had been thinking about this since 7 in the morning. She had been, if she was being honest, thinking about some version of it since the night on the ballroom floor. I want him ruined, she said. The word had a cleanness to it that surprised her. Not ruined violently, ruined publicly. Ruined in a way that removed his ability to perform his way out of it. I want everything he's done to be visible. I want the people who looked the other way at the party, and before the party, and in all the years before I left him, I want them to have to look directly at it. I don't want him dead. I want him known. A pause. Longer than the last one. Yes, Tae-Hyun said. I can do that. What happened to Ryan even happened over 6 days. It was not violent. It was meticulous, public, and irreversible in the specific way that certain kinds of destruction are irreversible. The kind where the man is still standing, but has nothing left to stand on. Where the performance that protected him for years is dismantled so completely that there is no room left for him to perform. The kind where people who looked away are forced to look, because looking away is no longer available as an option. His financial accounts were flagged in an audit that had apparently been building for some time. The documentation required to trigger the formal investigation arrived, from an anonymous source, in a clean digital package that was impeccably organized. His business partnerships dissolved within 48 hours of the first news cycle. Partners who had known, or suspected, or chosen not to ask, and who now found that the cost of the association had become impossible to absorb. His investors received a separate document, also anonymous, also impeccably organized, that detailed not only the financial irregularities, but the pattern of intimate partner violence he had been insulating himself from for years. Police reports that had been filed and dropped. Hospital records. 3 women, 2 of whom had never spoken publicly, who now agreed to go on record because they had been contacted by someone who promised, credibly, that they would not be doing this alone and that the ground beneath Ryan's feet was already moving. By the 4th day, his name was in 3 separate news cycles, each one making the previous one look preliminary. By the 5th, his accounts were frozen and 2 civil suits had been filed. By the 6th, he had no PR firm willing to take his call and no ally whose association with him was worth more than their distance from him. He was arrested on a Thursday afternoon. The footage played across several platforms a man in a very good coat, in front of a very good building in handcuffs. Not frantic. Not performatively calm. Just a man whose performance had finally run out of material. Ameera watched it once. She watched it sitting in her own apartment, in her own chair, with her plants in her windows and her key in her lock, and she felt, not satisfaction exactly, which was too simple, and not relief exactly, which was too temporary. Something more like the particular, specific weight of a thing that has been present in your body for years suddenly no longer being there. A held breath released. A vigilance completed. She put her phone down. She went and watered her plants. Tae-Hyun came that evening. He knocked. She opened the door. He was carrying 2 coffees from the place near the river that she had mentioned, once, in passing, that she preferred above everywhere else in the neighborhood. She stepped back to let him in. They sat on her second-hand sofa, the one she'd found at an estate sale the week after she moved in, which was slightly too low and extremely comfortable, and they drank the coffee and said nothing for a while. Not the silence of people who don't know what to say, but the silence of people who have stopped performing ease for each other and arrived at the actual ease underneath it. "He's going to prison," she said eventually. "Yes. The civil suits and the criminal charges compound. It will be significant." "Will he stay?" "For a significant amount of time." He looked at her. "Are you satisfied with that?" She considered it genuinely. "I think satisfied isn't quite the word. I think it's correct. It's proportionate. It's what he actually did, made visible, with actual consequences." She looked out the window for a moment. "That's more than most people get." "Yes," he said. "It is." She turned back to him. "Is everything gone? The contracts, the debt arrangements, all of it. Is there anything left anywhere?" "There is no document, no claim, no arrangement, in any ledger connected to any of this, that names you in any capacity." He held her gaze steadily. "You're free. Actually, completely, in every operational sense." She nodded slowly. "I want to say something." "Okay. I'm grateful for what you did. I mean that without qualification and without it being complicated." She met his eyes. "I'm also aware that you knew who I was before I knew who you were. That you made decisions about my life, protective decisions, necessary decisions, without asking me first. And I want you to know that I have complicated feelings about that, and that those 2 things are both true at the same time." He nodded. "I know. You're not going to explain it?" "I'll say that the decision to buy the contract was made in a window of approximately 2 hours when the alternative was significantly worse, and I made it with the information I had. I'll say that I should have told you sooner, and that the correct response when someone tells you they have complicated feelings about a decision you made about their life is to listen, not defend." He paused. "And I'll say that I've been paying attention to you for longer than is probably comfortable for you to know, and that if I could do it differently I would tell you that sooner." She stared at him. "What?" he said, with a slight quality she hadn't heard from him before, slightly less than his usual composure, which was itself a kind of composure she was learning to read. "That's a better answer than I expected." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Adjacent to one. "I have those occasionally." They talked for another 2 hours. She told him about the night she actually left Ryan, Not the abstract version she gave in therapy, the full version. The 3-week bag hidden under a tarp in her car, the friend whose floor she'd slept on. The first morning in her own apartment when she'd stood in the kitchen at 6 a.m. and realized she hadn't been afraid of a sound in the night. He told her more about the sister. Her name was Jisoo. She was 24. She was in graduate school in London for environmental law. And the way he said her name communicated everything about what she meant to him without any of it being stated directly. He didn't ask for anything. He stood to leave at 10. She walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway in the way of two people for whom the evening was technically over, and the conversation was not. "There's an event," he said. 3 weeks from now. She waited. The same venue. Same ballroom. "I have a standing invitation." I thought. He stopped, and she watched something happen in his expression that was different from any expression she had seen on him before. A slight asymmetry, a fraction of the certainty temporarily absent. "I thought, if you wanted, you might come with me." Not as anything arranged. Not under any protection or prior agreement. Just you, choosing to be in that room. She thought about the marble floor. She thought about her palms. She thought about 60 people and the directions they had found to look. She thought about one man who had set down his glass. "Yes," she said. "Okay." 3 weeks later, Ameera stood at the entrance to the same ballroom in the same red dress. She had thought carefully about the dress. She had stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, considering whether wearing it was brave or performative, and whether the distinction mattered, and whether doing it because it felt like a reclamation was a sufficient reason. She had decided, yes, the red dress. This room. This time. There was nothing wrong with a deliberate act of reclamation performed in full awareness of being deliberate. Tae-Hyun was beside her. Not in front, not with a hand at her back in the particular proprietary way she'd learned to recognize as control dressed as care. Beside her, which was a specific, chosen position, one that communicated presence without claiming territory, which she understood by now was his way of most things. The room parted. It did it the way rooms parted for him, not because he demanded it, but because something about his presence created space automatically, and the people in those spaces had the good sense to step into them. She recognized faces. 3 people who had been here the night Ryan pushed her to the floor and had found somewhere else to look. They looked at her now. Some of them had the basic decency to look uncomfortable. She didn't perform forgiveness for them. She didn't perform anything. She was done performing for rooms. She just let the ballroom be a ballroom, a place with chandeliers and marble floors and people who were and weren't what they appeared to be, and she stood in it without flinching, which Kezia had told her, for months ago, was the whole point. Tae-Hyun leaned fractionally toward her. "You okay?" She thought about the question with the fullness it deserved, the way she'd learned to think about questions that deserved fullness. "Yes," she said. "I actually am." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked ahead, at the room, at the people who were watching and the people who were pretending not to. She reached out and took his hand. Not because she needed something to hold. Not because the room was watching. Because she wanted to, and wanting to was hers to act on a choice she was making in a room that had once tried to be the site of her breaking, in the presence of the same people who had allowed the attempt, with full awareness that they would see it and interpret it however they interpreted things. She didn't care what they made of it. She cared that it was hers. Tae-Hyun looked down at her hand in his. He looked at her. And then, for the first time in the weeks she had known him, for the first time with her, genuinely, without any of the careful management of expression she had watched him maintain through creditors and ballrooms and difficult conversations at kitchen tables. He smiled. Not the controlled, adjacent to a smile she'd been cataloging. A real one. Quiet, private, aimed only at her. She kept his hand and walked into the room. Drop your location and the time you're watching. This story isn't over. If you want to know what happens when Ameera's past surfaces one last time, subscribe. Part 2 is coming.